Thanks, Professor Rizvi, for your interesting and very scholarly lecture. Now it's time for questions.
Thanks for an interesting lecture. From what you said, it seems that there is a certain contradiction between freedom as an esoteric issue and those exoteric dimension of religion, in other words, religious obligations. So my question is for Sadra, there is a possibility of achieving this esoteric metaphysical self-realization with an exoteric part, exoteric dimension, or let me put in another way, does a person who has already achieved theosis, is he still in need of an exoteric government, let's say so?
I think his clear response would be that you have to have, I think I mentioned somewhere along the line, this complementarity between the exoteric and the esoteric. So the outward practice always has to remain the case, but there is a sort of a deepening of that through much further spiritual practices. So it's not the case that you ever give up on the exoteric, because that submission to the divine, even in the exoteric aspect, is ultimately freedom for him as well.
For me also quite a new lecture. One proposal, you were wondering how to render tamanna, wish you proposed. In classical Christian diction, there is the desiderium for God. I think, I'm not sure, I think the Greek of that is epithumia, pronounced in the English way, epithumia, we would say, epithumia. I think that is the Greek origin, and maybe then the Arabic, Persian traditions are referring to that concept. One totally other question, topical but not so much to your point really, is, because people are constantly discussing a lot what happens when Muslims arriving in Europe ask for baptism. So the question is, are there fairly authoritative recent convincing declarations that the traditional regulation on apostasy is no longer valid, as far as I know, as far as we know, not, but since that is a bit concerning at least the quranic verse you were dealing with too, it might be a question that could be touched by you, but obviously totally different context. Thank you.
Thank you for the great presentation, Professor. And my question is that when we see religion as esoteric dimension and practice, what is the place of habitualization, of socialization of religion that is somehow happened when we were born? Like, I was born as a Muslim, and that's why I'm a Muslim at the very first place. So what is the place of compulsion in that, if I may ask from the Mulla Sadra's perspective? Are there any opinion that mention the place of habitualization and socialization practices in the society as a form of compulsion, or it is accepted as a natural dimension, so that my religion is actually an esoteric one rather than an exoteric one? Thank you.
Some other question? Answer.
Firstly, on the tamanna, as you mentioned, I need to go back and look a bit more at it's a hadith, it's a saying of the Prophet that he's citing. So I'd have to look a bit more at the context and whether there is a particular kind of intertextuality going on there. It's possible, it's also, if it were, it's more likely to be possibly coming from Greek or Syriac debates, but I'm not really familiar with that. Certainly the idea that faith is this particular tamanna, or that religion is merely love, is quite widespread. There are a number of hadith, particularly in the Shia tradition, on that. Like for example, there's a famous one from Imam Ṣadr, the sixth Imam, which says, there's no religion but love. Hub term is used. Now, is apostasy still valid? Or rather, perhaps the punishment for apostasy. Certainly, Mulla Sadra doesn't deal with the question of apostasy in a straightforward manner. I don't know enough of the actual practice which might have been in this particular milieu. We know something about things which are going on in the Safavid period. Broadly speaking, what's quite interesting in the Shi'i legal context is that there is much more theory than practice on this particular issue. Apart perhaps from, apart perhaps from the Islamic Republic of Iran. In the sense that a number of jurists do talk about apostasy is very grave and it carries with it punishment, but historically there has been very little practice upon this theory, and I think the main reason for that is quite simply the absence of a state. Capital punishments require the presence of a state. I don't actually know, it's not really my kind of area, but I don't know if there are explicit pronouncements of current jurists and theologians on a moratorium on punishments of this sort. I do know that there is a very important classical position which was upheld and is even upheld by individuals now, which is that anything which is normatively considered to bear a capital punishment cannot be implemented in the absence of the 12th Imam. And that's considered to be quite now that's obviously not the position of the Islamic Republic of Iran. As I said, I'm just not familiar with what the reasoning is in state terms going on there, but certainly sort of a traditionalist Shia position would be very straightforward. It's just not applicable. On the question of how socialization of religion, and his point is that it's not that being a muqallid, following the social exigencies and mores of one's time is in itself wrong. It's just that one has to move beyond that. And there's also recognition because he's an elitist that not everyone can do that. There's a very famous, in the opening to the whole of his exegesis, he has this conception that the fundamental point about exegesis, which is the same as the point about hikmah, is it's about human realization and becoming. So, if one were not to read the Quran, were not to contemplate the Quran, were not to study philosophy, then, to put it bluntly, you might as well be a worm. That's what he says. It's like hashara, alive. It's of no consequence. But you have to make the effort. And fundamentally, there are kind of two steps to the effort which continue. One is the exoteric practice is important. There is this notion that he mentions elsewhere. It comes up again. There's this notion of, Dīn is ādah. It's habit. That's also the case. It's something that habitually you perform and you perform again and again. And that's the beginning. That's the beginnings of it. But ultimately, if you want to go beyond that, you have to attach yourself to this sort of prophetic notion of philosophy as a way of life. And I think ultimately for him, you have to attach yourself with a sage who can actually teach you how you go beyond that particular thing. And while both the practice of the exoteric and even the attachment to the sage might be a sense in which one is coercing oneself or forcing oneself into a particular thing, the idea is that the goal is one in which there is only subsistence in God. And only if you subside in God, as I mentioned before, there is neither compulsion nor is there free will. Both of these concepts become completely meaningless. So there is a sense in which one goes beyond. But this practice of being trained by a sage, I think, is quite important. And I will admit that this is very much my reading of it. Not everyone reads Mulla Sadra this way, but I've been heavily influenced by the late Febbraio, so I tend to read all this stuff too.
Thank you very much to PISAI for this conference, interesting conference, and also for Dr. Sajjad Rizvi for his deep and interesting approach to Mulla Sadra, the explanation of the word like Arabi. First of all, I would like to come back to the verb atamanna, very important. Atamanna in Arabic means willingly wish. I mean, I wish with will. So it's kind of focus on that wish, not like daily wish, but it's a wish between the believer and God. So it's very important, and there's kind of will in that wish. So I think that's in Arabic. Maybe it is more than that. It's more than what I say, but at least I mean to my knowledge, what I can say about that word atamanna. Dr. Sajjad has mentioned many very famous Iranian scholars, among them Mullā Ṣadrā, Mir Damad, and also there are others. So I think the philosophical approach of Mulla Sadra is what Dr. Sajjad has tried to shed light on concerning that word like 15. So I think that if we can really mean what like 15 can go, we should go to the ground and see what's going on the 20th and 21st century. If that Later Islamic was not implemented in its right way, we will not have other believers of other confessions living in the Middle East and North Africa, Jews and Christians living together. So the result of that Later Islamic, that reality till the 20th century, before the coming of the new trend of migrations for a reason or another. So that's another point. Another thing, just I want Dr. Sajjad to have more explanation on that, is to what extent Mulla Sadra was successful in distinguishing between what you call elite and non-elite conception of Islam. So, and is there any, that one of the two is overwhelming the other, or there's an equilibrium, or what's going on now on the ground that reflects also that. Another point, in comparison with other scholars, that between inverted commas Shia approach from a point of view of Shia. So, in comparison with other scholars from other groups, so to what extent we can say that Mulla Sadra was successful in his approach? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Rizvi. I don't understand clearly how Mulla Sadra can contribute to the Islamic current debate about religious freedom. Because I think the concept of freedom in today is a new concept. So our expectation from Mulla Sadra could be different. It was something unthinkable, impensable, using the term of Arkun. So as contemporary Muslims today, what Mulla Sadra can tell us about freedom?
Thank you for the nice I just wanted to ask like the same connection of that freedom, like the freedom of one is the obligation of other. But like if somebody from Muslim enters another religion is against, and if somebody enters Islam is contrary. How do you see this aspect of forced conversion to Islam or to other religion? Sometimes, many times, where the Muslims are majority, the minority have more suffering, and the view is different. Where the Muslims are in minority, so the total understanding is different. So in that sense, I just wanted to know about your personal view.
Absolutely. I think Tamanna has a very active and volitional aspect to it, which I guess I didn't bring out. It's not wish in this kind of wishy-washy, passive sense of like something, oh yeah, it'd be nice if this were the case. It's something which is much more focused and direction. I think that's true. And, as I said, I need to go back to the original text and have a look at more of that. In terms of this question of, how does this relate to what happens in reality? Again, I don't want the paper necessarily, or what I'm presenting, to be taken in a necessarily normative way, and that relates to the other questions. I'm a historian, so I'm interested in how he looks at this within a particular context of understanding the nature of philosophy. Whether it's of relevance to the contemporary world is something that I'm quite agnostic about. I'm certainly not the sort of person who champions Mulla Sadra as the panacea for all our problems nowadays, far from it. In fact, I think that's not what we need. What we do, however, need is for Muslims to engage much more with their intellectual traditions. And that's fundamentally what is not the case. So it could well be that one of the problems of the contemporary world is that if someone were to ask your average believer, about forced conversion or apostasy and so forth, they will probably Google a jurist. They'll kind of Google a faqih, online faqih. What does this random person say? They don't even reflect on what this really means to do that. It's a fundamentally people talk about the lack of a magisterium in Islam. It's not the fact that there isn't a magisterium, it's the fact that people have no idea what it is or where it is. So it would be nice for Muslims to engage much more with their intellectual traditions. And if they did that, they'd understand things are a lot messier than they think. And for example, they would see that you have some very interesting thinkers who, believe that within religious context, yes, you can be coerced to perform certain things within, not across. I'll come back to that. But the final destination of everyone is heaven. The notion of apokatastasis, which is a very controversial one, you do have Muslim thinkers who believe in it. Not very many of them, but there are some who are very explicit in it. There are also others who believe in some sort of final cessation of punishment in the afterlife. As we know, that's a remarkably common position, I'd say. I think the vast majority of Muslims historically have held that punishment in hell is not eternal. So it's a question of understanding what that means, and fundamentally it's of understanding that, I said before, if religion is love, then you kind of need to just chill out a bit. You just need to be a bit less hung up about what is going on around you, less prescriptive. Everyone is not their brother's keeper, but rather, it's between that individual and the divine. It's about a particular path. So I think there's a lot more to say. That's kind of my own personal theological views, which are coming into which are different. But fundamentally, it's of it doesn't make sense to do that. In terms of the question of forced conversion, I mean, obviously I'm against forced conversions, but also I think Mulla Sadra is quite clearly against forced conversion as well, because he's not, I think that quotation I gave about, forcing someone to take on a faith, is that faith would be equally meaningless as someone who is forced to affirm something which he doesn't uphold in a sense. So, forcing someone to convert from one to another is clearly meaningless and wrong. But that doesn't mean you cannot have some elements of coercion once one has accepted the faith to act in a particular way. And coercion, of course, works in lots of different ways. I mean, we're not just talking about like beating people. Coercion works in different ways. I mean, we all know this. When you're growing up, your parents kind of use kind of emotional blackmail. And sort of say, you should do this, or if you do this, you'll get this, or etc. I mean, in a sense, that's coercive. There's elements of where even kind of love can be coercive. It's not necessarily the case that everything is good and simple. It is an element of coercion which one submits to or accepts because of the context in which it's placed. But that's a very different thing from the use of violence. So what I mean is, coercion doesn't always have to be about violence. Yes, I mean, the question of what does it contribute to our debates about freedom, I think it goes back to this issue of, is it the case that most liberal conceptions of freedom nowadays, are they positive conceptions or negative conceptions? And I tend to think that most liberal conceptions are negative conceptions of freedom. They're about basically being unfettered, about being unfettered about anything which is beyond the, what Mulla Sadra would probably call hawa nafs. And then of course for someone like Sadra, what it basically means is then your unfettered notion of freedom in itself is not freedom, because it shows a dominion of mere caprice. So the question is how does one have a positive notion of freedom? And yes, that may well at the beginning levels involve a particular notion of coercion of different types once you've entered into a particular path. But ultimately the fact would be that the freedom would exist. The freedom would be in subsistence in the divine, which is the ultimate goal. That doesn't actually necessarily help our rights-based discourse nowadays. But we just have to be honest and realize that rights-based discourses, I would argue, have nothing to do with religion. The human rights discourse is completely removed from religious discourses. It has a particular history. We can think about how we reconcile these sorts of things for all sorts of reasons, but they fundamentally have nothing to do with religious conceptions of freedom, of will, of directionality, and so forth. And they certainly have very little to do with love.
I'm still very much a non-specialist coming at this from a different angle. I'm writing a doctoral dissertation on Pope Benedict and his contribution to interreligious dialogue, and famously he quoted this passage in the Regensburg address in 2006, followed by a response by 38 Muslims saying that he was wrong in saying that it is an early passage when he was still in the minority, and affirming that it's still valid for Muslims today. There was no official answer from the Vatican, but there was an answer by some Christians, some of who were accosted from Islam on the internet, saying that the answer of the 38 Muslims disregarded the fact that all the earliest Islamic commentators, such as Ibn Kathir, Tabari, Qurtubi, or Al-Jalalain, all give different explanations of this verse, and it is clear from all of them that this verse was abrogated by the sword verse. So this is their response, and I would like your perspective on two things. So how strong is this opinion in the tradition, and how strong is this opinion today, and is this really the or a central issue in the interpretation of this, whether it's abrogated or not, or is this just a popular, I don't know, you go on from there.
Thank you. Enriquez.
Thank you very much. As it is written in Al-Baqarah, verses 2:56, that there is no compulsion in the religion. It is right, and I agree with that. But I do not agree with the people who say that terrorists, for example ISIS, is not Islam. Because in fact, these people, this radical group, they use some Quranic verses to justify the violence what they do. So I don't know what is your opinion about this. Maybe in the open letter of Muslim scholars to al-Baghdad as well, saying that this ISIS is not Islam. Thank you.
Okay, it is the final round.
I think I did mention that one of the views that Mulla Sadra mentions later is that this idea that it's abrogated, but it's not one he accepts. So, yes, there are individuals in the exegetical tradition who say that. Friedman talks about that extensively. But in a sense, that doesn't really matter. It's very difficult for someone to say, well, you know, it's the majority opinion or not a majority opinion, because there are a number of interpretations which go both ways. There are a number of individuals who reject it. There are, of course, historically and also in the contemporary period, there are people who reject abrogation completely, you know, and say that abrogation is just not something which happens. I think it's quite clear, certainly from Mulla Sadra's position, that it's not abrogated by the sword voice. That would certainly be his position, because he extensively talks, I think I mentioned at least one case where he does talk about the people of the book, the Ahlul Kitab, certainly not, there is no way they can be coerced to become Muslim. That's just not an option. And he's quite explicit on that. And it would be very meaningless for him to talk about people who have absolutely no faith or whatever being coerced to become Muslim as well. I think that wouldn't be the case as well. But yeah, of course, a reasonable response perhaps from you would be, but I mean, is Mulla Sadra important? Maybe it's not very important. You know, I mean, this is not an extremely well-known exegesis. I mean, I think it's important because it's by far the most significant philosophical exegesis, I think, in the whole tradition. That's a different matter. But certainly there are a number of individuals who have held that it's not abrogated by the sword verse, and certainly those who, including those who reject abrogation as such. It's so difficult to know to gauge anything nowadays, precisely because of what I was mentioning about the lack of access to a magisterium, and almost every attempt to kind of do this does fail. But I mean, linking to the other question, it's also the case that you have had attempts to bring people together and say, no, this is just not the case. From a more normative perspective, one might be very cynical about these sort of common statements of different ulama from different backgrounds, such as the letter to Baghdadi or whatever. I have lots of reservations about it as well, but that's precisely the sort of thing that they mentioned again as well, that there's a fundamental misreading which is going on with respect to those verses from Surah Al-Baqarah about how you deal with others and how you deal with the kind of the dominion, if you want, of an imperial Islam. And one can't kind of completely dismiss that as being of no consequence, because fundamentally then it becomes a question of ideology. Do you believe that these kind of more liberal or even perhaps more conservative actually views are dominant, or does one believe that, for example, Islam is reducible to ISIS? Really, that's what it becomes. This is Islam, there's nothing else, or no, actually it's much more complicated. And that's why, I mean, I personally think this debate about whether ISIS is Islamic is completely pointless. It's completely pointless. Because, if you argue either way, you've got a problem. You can't say it's Islamic in a normative sense, because it's clearly continuous with elements of tradition, and it's also clearly discontinuous with elements of tradition, particularly with more modern conceptions of it. At the same time, it's not terribly useful to kind of say it's not related to Islam at all, because there's clearly elements in which there are, you can trace types of justification which are going on. It's something which some contemporary Muslims have come up with, but some contemporary Muslims come up with all sorts of things. They come up with there are all sorts of trends and ways in which contemporary Muslims appropriate things and say this is what Islam is, whether that's about violence, whether that's about freedom, whether that's sort of the extreme use of violence, whether that's even sort of LGBT kind of notions of Muslim identity and so forth. So it's much more varied than people think. Now, so the sort of historical reality of how people make sense of things is fundamentally quite different to the normative claims you might make from them. I don't think you can jump from a historical reality to say, well, this means that normatively it is the case, always has been, always will be, that Islam is X. One of the things I always say to my students is, there's a basic futility in asking, is Islam X, as a question, and similarly in making a statement such as Islam is X. So just as it's pointless, I think, to say Islam is a religion of violence, similarly I think it's completely pointless to say Islam is a religion of peace. Normatively, they're questionable statements. Historically, one can find evidence both ways.
So now it is time to close this lecture. I'd like to remember you that the next lecture will be on 17th of March, the oldest quranic manuscripts by Professor Alba Fedeli from the University of Birmingham. Thanks, Professor Rizvi, and thanks to you all. I wish you a brilliant and joyful evening.